My name is Eleanor Northaft. My husband was in the union, Local 282. As I'm getting older, I'd like somebody to fight for me. So I called up Retiree First.
Hi.
And I got Brooke.
So nice to meet you. I'm Brooke. I'm an advocate at Retiree First. I've been working with Eleanor for 3 years. She was one of my first calls. I helped her with transportation to her doctors, getting her glasses reimbursed.
Oh, they are pretty fancy.
I'm basically just answering any questions she has.
And I always have a lot of questions.
Not too many.
I have a friend there. I love it because I can depend on her to help me out in any situation.
Oh, I'm excited.
She always comes through for me.
It's another edition of the Labor and Energy Show with JDoc and Krausey. Welcome in, everyone, to another week here in what is now the start, or pretty close to the start, of the summer of 2024. JDoc, good show lined up again. We've had a lot of fascinating guests over the last few weeks. I'll let you share with the audience our guest for the full show today in just a moment. I do want to put an action alert out to our viewers and our listening audience about the rally coming up that we will be providing coverage for right here on the Labor and Energy Show. Should be pretty good stuff. That coming up, I believe the rally is a week away. But we'll have coverage, and of course, we'll present that as part of the Labor and Energy Show series.
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. So it's a rally with the American fuel and petrochemical manufacturers, and you know it's about the EV mandates, okay? And one of those things, that we talk about a lot on this broadcast is when it comes to electric vehicles. Of course, we support them, but we're not about banning, gasoline-fueled cars. And so the June 18 Mid-Atlantic Rally, Save Our Jobs, Don't Ban Our Cars. Of course, you and I will be broadcasting and doing a show from the station, and we're going to have individuals on location. So definitely a big deal. Again, the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers is the host. It's in New Jersey. The previous rally was in Toledo. So definitely good stuff. And certainly a lot of our unions are going to be there, and a lot of our political leaders. And of course, this action needs to be taken now before we make some mistakes, that devastate a lot of people, as well as a lot of industry. So point well.
Yeah, pretty good stuff. We covered the rally, as you referenced, from Toledo, Ohio. We'll cover this one as part of as you said, the Mid-Atlantic.
And it'll be broadcast, so it'll be a full show.
Yep, full show, committed to it for sure. And I will tell you this, as we transition into you setting the table for our audience on our very special guest today, more and more, there is more and more conversation, JDoc, around the dinner table, out on the patio, while walking. People are starting to educate themselves more, specifically about that. I was involved in two big conversations this weekend that were not randomly planned. They were unsolicited conversations. So we will continue to educate the public. Tell us about our guest today.
Well, first I want to say that's great to hear.
Yeah.
Because, everybody knows about electric vehicles. There's issues, supply chain issues, obviously, with them, and all kinds of stuff that, we want the opportunity to address. However, you throw the word mandates on there, and it's great to hear that the regular folks like you and I are talking about that at dinner table discussions, because the impacts are going to be devastating if we don't take action. So anyway, great show we have today. We have Nick Iacovella back on the program. He's the Senior Vice President, Public Affairs and Communications for the Coalition for a Prosperous America, CPA. Nick is the former Deputy Director of Communications for Senator Marco Rubio and the Director of Communications for the Senate Committee on Small Businesses and Entrepreneurship. And one of the things Our big discussion today is going to be on solar, and we're going to be getting updates. Lots going on. Again, Nick is with the Coalition for Prosperous America, which is an organization that represents U.S. manufacturers working to protect and expand domestic manufacturing. The CPA counts the Teamsters as one of its members, and First Solar was also a member. So, yeah, lots been in the news about solar power. So we wanted to have Nick back on the program, to get an update on what's happening with solar in the U.S., as well as an update on the current state of U.S. policies impacting the solar sector. So lots going on.
We'll get that started right after our first commercial break. As we go into the break, I will remind everyone that you can download a podcast version of this show and all of the labor and energy shows on Apple or Spotify. Just search the Labor and Energy Show. We'll also have a YouTube video link as well, posted up for you to watch today's broadcast if you would like to do that. We'll get to a commercial break. JDoc and Nick will get us started on the other side.
The best way to describe Anthony, David, and Jane are that they're my brothers. I met Anthony at LA Fitness because I noticed that he had a Teamster's bag and his dad was a Teamster leader.
I'm a third generation son of labor. My grandmother worked in a factory. My mother and father were both Teamster members. I don't think there's a trade that I don't have a family member in.
What's so big for me coming from a union background is what affects one member affects the entire membership.
A lot of people can relate to the issues that individuals deal with. We pride ourselves on empathy.
The big value that's always instilled in you if you grow up in a union household is the importance of brotherhood. People that lean on each other, that rely on each other.
When we were building this business, having that background and knowing what matters most to the union members is really what we use to drive and build out Retiree First.
Welcome to Pond Lehocky, the largest workers' compensation law firm in Pennsylvania. With over 250 years of combined courtroom experience, we've helped over 100,000 injured and disabled workers obtain benefits, as well as some of the biggest settlements in the state. Even better, Pond Lehocky doesn't charge a dime until you win. If you've been injured at work, give Pond Lehocky a call.
Is the best vacation one that you find, or one you get lost in? One that takes you to new heights, or reminds you to go with the flow? To get your feet wet and your wheels spinning? One that lets you find your own rhythm, or get carried away? Find the best of yourself. Get lost in the woods. Plan your stay in the Wildwoods today.
Welcome back to the Labor and Energy Show on the Jacob Media Network. I'm ecstatic to have Nick Iacovella from the Coalition for Prosperous America back on the program. Nick, how are you, sir?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back.
It's great to have you back on the program. And for our listeners, you're obviously no stranger to the broadcast, but for our new listeners, if you would tell them a little bit more about the Coalition for a Prosperous America, and if you would remind our listeners about your experience, in particular with solar and how you got into the solar energy space.
Yeah, absolutely. So Coalition for Prosperous America, or CPA as we call it, is kind of a unique trade association. We represent exclusively domestic manufacturers, workers. We have some farmers and ranchers. And so I think a good way to think about what we do is if you're an American worker or American manufacturer who's committed to producing in this country, if you're committed to creating good paying jobs in communities across the nation, then you could be a member of us. If you produce in China and you have no operations in the US, we would not take you as a member. So we're the preeminent organization fighting for American workers and manufacturers in DC and all across the country.
And so having said that, one of the things that is important, so much going on when it comes to our energy sector and solar. And it was a big part of our conversation and so much to talk about. But before we get into the policy details are recent. Can you give us, our listeners, a broad update on the current state of the U.S. solar sector?
Yeah, absolutely. So really in the last 2 years, the solar market has been decimated by illegal and predatory activity by the Chinese solar producers. And a lot of that is coming in through Southeast Asia. And one of the most damaging policies that allowed the Chinese to have unfettered access to the U.S. was a policy that the White House implemented in June 2022 called the Solar Emergency Declaration. And the White House at the time, they called that a bridge. And this was before the Inflation Reduction Act had passed. So I think a bridge is really a misnomer. You know, what the actual rule was it was a pipeline for China to dump solar products into the U.S. illegally by circumventing AD/CVD orders. But the White House allowed them to do that for 24 months with no repercussions. It prevented any retroactive duties. And so what we've had between June 2022 and it just ended last week, you know, is not surprisingly a massive dumping of products into the U.S. And so the rule, thankfully, is ended, but the damage has really been done. There's about 2 years worth of panels sitting in warehouses, and those have to be used by December 6th, 180 days after this rule was over, this tariff moratorium. There's absolutely no way to install 2 years worth of panels, you know, in 6 months. And so what Customs and Border Protection is supposed to do is if any of those panels are installed after December 6th, after the 180 days, is they're supposed to actually pay, you know, a duty. So it's a little bit unclear how CBP is going to enforce that. But it's really a shame that the White House went ahead with that rule, because the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed in August, so, you know, just 2 months after this emergency declaration, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is probably familiar to a lot of your listeners, the IRA, that is the strongest industrial policy bill that the United States has ever passed. And it's particularly important for the renewable energy industry and for solar in particular. And there's massive, powerful tools in there, production tax credits, 45X is the actual tax credit. There's an investment tax credit to stand up production. So on the one hand, we, as the government, we passed a major industrial policy law to incentivize domestic production of the solar industry all throughout the supply chain. So from polysilicon, ingots, wafers, modules, you know, all the way to finished product. And then on the other side, we really kicked ourselves because we allowed the Chinese to illegally circumvent our tariffs and dump product. So those two things are opposed. And you know, thankfully, like I said, it ended last week, but, you know, the damage has been done. And there's a couple trade cases that are relevant to what we're talking about. And most recently, there's a trade case filed in April by 7 major U.S. solar manufacturers across the country. So the largest solar manufacturers in the U.S. Filed a new trade case because there's circumvention and dumping going on from Southeast Asia. And when I say Southeast Asia, what I really mean is Chinese companies operating there. So initially, the Chinese companies had massive production facilities in China. The tariffs actually date all the way back to President Obama in 2012. And so they moved production to Southeast Asia to get around our trade laws, you know, something China's very good at. And so that's why this new trade case is so important. So there's a lot going on in solar. The trade case, the ITC voted last week to move ahead with the investigation. So that's good. I think the evidence is pretty clear, you know, that China is, what they're doing is illegal. And so we'll see what happens. We'll find out, you know, in the next couple weeks and months what the trade case is going to be decided. But that's a really important piece. And it's not that we want to tilt the playing field into the U.S. companies. This is just creating a level playing field. You know, I face a lot of opposition sometimes from so-called free trade or free market, you know, conservatives or academics. And this isn't about, the strong government hand or anything like that, or, abandoning free markets. What China is doing, they're not operating in a free market. There's no such thing there. So we're trying to create a level playing field, because if you put the American worker against a foreign worker anywhere in the world, I'm going to pick the American worker.
Well,
right?
Nick, let me jump in there, because there's so many areas that you just touched on that are right a part of what we're going to talk about. Here's a dumb question. Why would we create a situation where we allow China to dump 2 years worth of solar panels, right?
Right.
In the United States, and then you of course have the IRA, which does provide domestic tax breaks and all those things. But I could almost, when I think about individual, so you talk about individuals supporting, talking about free trade. It reminds me of democracy. You can, listen, this is an extreme state. You can burn the flag if you want. We've had people fighting in foreign wars for in our history to give you that right. Okay, but should you do it? Okay, free trade, right? Boy, you can use that any way you want, but you just said a mouthful there. Okay,
Yeah.
And I love the fact that people are laying on free trade, but not talking about the slave labor that is going on to manufacture these products. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So, slavery is a painful part of our history that haunts us every hour of every day as we live and breathe the air we're breathing. Okay. But I guess for some people, as long as it's not happening here, we can turn the blind eye to it. Okay. And trade is a very interesting area, because, you talk about a lot of the critical minerals that have to be mined. Okay. And you wonder how they get shipped over here. There's middlemen. So we're not actually buying from the people that are utilizing the slave labor and the child labor in the Congo, but we're buying from middlemen. So I guess we can look at ourselves in the mirror. Talk about some of them issues.
Yeah, and just on the moratorium, I mean, it's really one of the most damaging, harmful rules I think I've ever seen a White House issue. To talk about it and sort of what the rule is for dummies, right? Put it in simple terms. The Commerce Department said what the Chinese were doing was illegal. That's what they determined. A U.S. investigation, China's doing this illegal. What the White House said is, well, that's okay. Let's let them do it for 24 months and we won't punish them. But they just not better do it in the future. I mean, that is ridiculous for any American president to say we're going to ignore illegal Chinese activity. That's actually harming our workers, our manufacturers. And Congress actually did stand up to the president. There was a bill that was passed by Democrats and Republicans through the House and the Senate to repeal that rule. And unfortunately, the president vetoed it. And, at the time, he was just listening to the wrong people. There's unfortunately some folks in the administration and some industry groups that, as you mentioned, they're okay to look in the mirror and say, yeah, I'd like to import as much Chinese solar produced from coal-fired power plants and slave labor, because Al Gore told us in 2000 that Florida will be underwater in 10 years. I'm from Florida. It's 2024. It's the same place I grew up in. I'm all for climate change, addressing it, installing solar, but let's just do it with American companies. We have great technology here. We can still meet goals, the climate goals, but support our domestic manufacturers. There's got to be a balance there.
We say the same thing all the time. We need it. There has to be a balance. Okay.
Right.
One of the confusing things, and we talk about common sense and energy all day long, okay, is you look at the fact that our traditional energy resources and renewables coming into the market. Well, we're not trying to stop renewables. They're here. We care about the environment. Okay, there's nobody that doesn't care about it. We're just saying, you can't flick a switch, bro.
Exactly.
We do this together. Why the divide, Nick? Why the divide?
Well, in the case of one industry group that I often butt heads with, it's called the Solar Energy Industries Group Association, SEIA. When you actually look into their membership, and they held a lot of sway with the White House, especially the White House Climate Office, unfortunately. SEIA represents the very same Chinese solar manufacturers that are under investigation by our government. And so they're the ones that really pushed for this moratorium. And it's not surprising that they would want to protect their members, from U.S. law. What's unfortunate is that there's folks in the administration who listen to them. But if we fast forward to, now we're in 2024, you've seen some really interesting comments from Secretary Janet Yellen, from Lael Brainerd, the director of the National Economic Council. Both of them a few weeks ago talked about the need to address China's overcapacity. They're dumping into the U.S. market, why tariffs are important. So, this is, I think, a reversal from some of the comments that, these folks were making in the administration just a couple of years ago. And so I think that's a very good sign. The Biden administration actually issued a range of new actions just last month, about a month ago, to strengthen the U.S. solar manufacturing industry. They got rid of what was called the bifacial exclusion. So for people that don't know, on a solar panel, if you have a bifacial panel, it just means you can get energy from both sides. Well, unfortunately, the Trump administration messed up and allowed bifacial panels to come in without paying the Section 201 tariff. That was the exclusion. And they tried to fix it, but a judge, just a bureaucrat judge, denied them, even though it was the president of the United States trying to fix it. But the Biden administration thankfully got rid of that exclusion. And of course, as soon as the exclusion went into place a couple of years ago, people were installing bifacial panels on rooftops. And guess what? Those are fixed. There's no way that the bottom part of that panel that's glued to your roof is going to get solar. So you could see how China manipulates our trade laws. But the administration did a bunch of good actions recently. And so I do think that they recognized the moratorium was a mistake. They ended the moratorium. Of course, there was lobbying to keep the moratorium in place. And so I think what we're going to see now is a lot more support for the U.S. solar industry. These are really good jobs. That's what we have to remember. It's not that, we care about solar versus wind or, over oil or natural gas or LNG. But if we're going to say that we want to have a healthy domestic industry, then our industrial policy and our trade policy have to align. They can't be in opposition to each other like it was when we had the moratorium in place, but we passed the IRA. And the other thing about the IRA is there's hundreds of billions of dollars in taxpayer money that will be spent. And if we do it in a smart way, it's going to create jobs. It's going to create a good manufacturing industrial capacity and sector. And so that's going to be good for the economy. It's going to be good for workers. It's going to be good for communities. But if we do it in a way that doesn't acknowledge that trade policy has to align with it, then China's going to undermine it. And China's trying to undermine the IRA right now. That was why they dumped those panels in for 24 months. It's why they're setting up shop in different countries in Southeast Asia. As soon as the trade case was announced, 2 major Chinese solar manufacturers actually closed operations in Southeast Asia. Why? Because they want to go to another country so that they can then circumvent the tariffs and go into the U.S. So, we have to be very smart about how we do this. And I do think the administration is starting to recognize what they need to do.
Is there as I listen to you talk, it seems like there's a gap between, the technical side of things and the policy side. So you talk about how we're the administration's making mistakes. Trump administration made mistakes, and we're having to live through these things. Where's the gap? And certainly, I'm asking these questions for the listeners who really, it's confusing. When you talk about not being able to control your own trade, okay, and the tariffs. Right. We're going to get into in the next segment. I'd like to touch a little bit on the history of solar, because it was created. It was created
Absolutely.
here, and we have so little left. But where's the gap in a lot of energy issues are very technical, okay, very and a lot of language that's hard to understand. Is there a gap between the technical side and the political side?
There is somewhat, but in the case of the Biden administration, there's really two competing groups. There's folks in the administration who recognize that we shouldn't just allow China to dominate this industry. And so we need to take steps like the IRA. We need to have tariffs, maybe even quotas. And then there's another group in the administration, whose job is to address climate change. And those folks are opposed to tariffs, and they actually want to import as much solar as possible, meaning, that we can import as much Chinese solar as we need to because we have to install it. And that second group that's focused on just the climate change aspect of this is really missing, the importance of what we're trying to do. I just told you that there's 24 months of panels sitting in warehouses. The demand for solar has continued to rise every year. So it's not that we're in danger of not addressing climate change by installing renewables. It's that we're in danger of allowing a foreign adversarial nation to dominate an industrial sector that we could actually have in the United States. And why wouldn't we want those good jobs? Solar is the cheapest new form of electricity generation. So I tell my friends that who are conservatives, I said, if the renewable aspect, if the climate change aspect doesn't do it for you, if the good jobs aspect doesn't do it for you, at least you have to recognize it's a fact that it's a cheap form of energy. And it's a good thing to have a diversified grid. So we've really been competing against sort of the climate change group in the White House. And what's unfortunate is that if they actually looked at the facts, they would see that we're on the same side, because China's production of its solar industry is powered by a historic buildup of coal. So just last year, the rest of the world decommissioned coal plants. China built more coal-fired capacity than the rest of the world decommissioned combined. So we went down, but China went up. So we added net-based coal power. If you're a climate change person, you probably don't like coal. Now, of course, I think there's smart ways and cleaner ways to have coal-fired production, and we do it in the United States. I can promise you that China is not producing clean coal in China, and so we're really subsidizing the Chinese industry with what the climate change folks are supposed to be against. Why wouldn't you want to create the cleanest solar power in the United States and create these jobs? And that's the argument that we're making, and the facts are on our side.
Well, you could make that argument across the board in all
Absolutely.
areas of energy independence. We have to go to break, but before we do, I want to ask you one question. What is that conversation like when you talk to that segment of the administration that is blind to all that? We all live in the same world, on the same planet, the same ozone. Okay.
Yep.
If America shut down today, we only comprise 13% of the world's emissions. Okay.
Right.
What are the answers that come back to you when you're having that conversation? I'm asking you, what's that conversation like?
So something that we've heard from them is that, for instance, on the trade case, if we were to have tariffs in place, that installations would go down, prices would rise, we wouldn't meet climate goals. And it's really just a bunch of nonsense. We've installed more solar year over year, every single year. The demand is going to keep going up. And the unfortunate thing is that there's companies like NextEra who install solar, and they are addicted to the cheapest input that they can get. If they can get a cheap Chinese solar panel, that's, by the way, subsidized massively by the Chinese government. So the only reason that the Chinese companies are currently in business is because they have massive subsidies from the Chinese government. But, you know, a company like NextEra, they want to have as much profit as possible. So if they can get a very cheap product and they can install it for X amount, that's what they want. I've argued that we should not be basing policy on a company that is downstream in the process. We need to actually be doing industrial and trade policy based on the producers. If NextEra went out of business, there'd be another company to install panels. It'd be okay. But if Q-Cells or First Solar or Mission Solar go out of business in this country, there's not going to be another American manufacturer producing panels, and that's a big problem.
Let's do this, Nick. Let's take a quick break. We're going to have more from the Labor and Energy Show and our conversation with Nick Iacovella in just a minute.
The best way to describe Anthony, David, and Jan are that they're my brothers. I met Anthony at LA Fitness because I noticed that he had a Teamster's bag, and his dad was a Teamster leader.
I'm a third generation son of labor. My grandmother worked in a factory. My mother and father were both Teamster members. I don't think there's a trade that I don't have a family member in.
What's so big for me coming from a union background is what affects one member affects the entire membership.
A lot of people can relate to the issues that individuals deal with. We pride ourselves on empathy.
The big value that's always instilled in you if you grow up in a union household is the importance of brotherhood. People that lean on each other, that rely on each other.
When we were building this business, having that background and knowing what matters most to the union members is really what we use to drive and build out Retiree First.
Welcome to Pond Lehocky, the largest workers' compensation law firm in Pennsylvania. With over 250 years of combined courtroom experience, we've helped over 100,000 injured and disabled workers obtain benefits, as well as some of the biggest settlements in the state. Even better, Pond Lehocky doesn't charge a dime until you win. If you've been injured at work, give Pond Lehocky a call.
Is the best vacation one that you find, or one you get lost in? One that takes you to new heights, or reminds you to go with the flow? To get your feet wet and your wheels spinning? One that lets you find your own rhythm, or get carried away? Find the best of yourself. Get lost in the woods. Plan your stay in the Wildwoods today.
Welcome back to the Labor and Energy Show on the Jacob Media Network. We're continuing our conversation with Nick Iacovella, Coalition for a Prosperous America, CPA. Nick, you know, this conversation, it's like deja vu all over again, okay? You know, like Yogi Berra says, this situation with giving away our energy security, our entire supply chains, okay? We talk about electric vehicle mandates. Joe Krausey talked about, you know, the rally we're having next week with the AFPM. We're dying to give away everything that we have, okay? And depend on, countries that, like you mentioned it, they're, you know, you mentioned the workforce. What's more efficient than the American workforce? What's higher trained, number one. But more importantly, when it comes to the environmentalist, who does it more environmentally sound? Whose environmental standards are higher than the United States? Instead, we're willing to, allow individual, like you mentioned, like we coal-fired plants. Okay, we have the National Mining Association on our board. Okay, lots of progress going on here in America when it comes to, you know, mining. Critical minerals real important, but obviously coal as well. And the standards are as high as you can get. Yet they're building coal-fired plants in China without nearly the standards. I don't know if I could personally, Nick, I'm not sure I could personally stand in front of somebody who was making the argument that we need to open up our borders to free trade and have zero standards, and still have an environmental opinion on it when you bring up facts like the way they're doing things, in China and across the globe, it is nowhere near as efficient as we're talking about. So it's very confusing, not to mention the jobs and the slave labor and all that absolutely insane stuff. Let's talk about a few ironies here. I want to touch on the history of solar. Last time you were on the show, we touched on it. I want to remind our listeners about this, because you would swear that the automobile and solar and other industries were created in China, but no. Talk about
That's right.
Talk about where solar was invented.
Yeah, so this is an American innovation, much like most of the great technological innovations of the 20th century. We invented this technology right here in the United States. For a while, we actually were the major country producing solar, and then around 2000, China figured out that this is going to be an important industry in the 21st century economy. Not because China cares about renewable energy, not because China cares about climate change. I don't think they care about any of those things. They care about jobs. And China's economy is built on overproducing so that the rest of the world can consume it. That is the only way that China has sustained economic growth.
Now, before you go on there, when you talk about jobs, not sure when it comes to those type of jobs. What type of, and I don't know if this is the discussion we can get into, but what type of paying jobs? Like, in other words, what are the wages that they're paying over there? Is it, we talked there, about this a transition here in the United States from traditional energy to renewables. Now, it's obvious that we need to do that together, and we need to work together, and that we're going to need a balanced approach, like you had said. Okay, but in the United States, to think that you could, transition. Well, we've had Sean Steffi go to a renewables job fair, and the jobs for these particular situations nowhere near a union rate. Okay, and I'm not saying that and maybe that's an organizing issue and all that, but when you talk about jobs in China, okay, and why they can manufacture, first thing it reminds me of is the Apple plant over there with the suicide, the suicide nets. What type of jobs are we talking about? And are those type of jobs, obviously part of the equation that make it possible for China to be able to manufacture, products and things like solar panels and undercut us?
Yeah, I mean, the environmental and labor standards in China are nowhere near what they are in the United States. And the major Chinese solar manufacturers have all been credibly accused and documented of using forced labor in their supply chain. So, you're not paying a forced labor worker, obviously.
We're not in a union, of course.
Yeah, right. They don't have any rights. And it's really a travesty that we allow any forced labor product to come into the United States at all.
Anything.
I mean, Congress did pass a law that my old boss actually wrote, Senator Rubio, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And what that law says is that if you have any product or input that comes from Xinjiang, as the U.S. government, we're going to assume that it's made with forced labor unless you prove otherwise. And implementation of that law has had its challenges. I think that there'll have to be an update to it at some point. We need stricter enforcement. There is an entity list from that law, so the UFLPA entity list. If you're on that list, you can't have any product imported to the U.S. But there's no comparison between a job in the United States and a job in China. There just isn't.
And I just wanted to cover the basis of that. In other words, when you talk about China seeing an opportunity, obviously, because solar is going to be huge. It's ass backwards. Okay. I mean, they see an opportunity. They are a communist country, so they can do whatever they want when it comes to wages, and so they can easily cut us that, and we're helping them do it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Our policies are actually the moratorium, for instance, was a pro-China policy. That's the only way to describe it. And just you mentioned something about free trade. I want to make a point. There's no such thing as free trade in the real economy. Zero. There's no example of it that you could point to. The only places that free trade exists are in textbooks and in the classroom.
Well, shouldn't it be free and fair trade? Free and fair trade.
Yeah. I mean, I know that free trade is a great phrase that people like to use but what we're really talking about is trade that, like you said, is fair. But some people don't like the fair word. From my perspective, our trade policy should align with our economic priorities. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if we have a company manufacturing a product in the United States and there's a market for it, and a foreign competitor comes in and undercuts that market, whether with subsidies, with forced labor, with environmental or labor standards that aren't equal to ours,
we should have tariffs.
They dump product, right? Well, guess what happens to our company? They have to lay off workers. They have to maybe even close up shop. Why should the U.S. government be okay with that? I don't want to be a country where we just have a bunch of jobs at fast food restaurants and services, and we don't produce anything because we're getting all the stuff from China.
Exactly.
That's not a strong country. A country that doesn't make anything is not a strong country, period. And I want to be a strong country. And also, a manufacturing job is much more valued to the economy than any other job. Why? Because an economist will disagree on this, of course, because economists, it's hard for them to agree on anything. But there's one manufacturing job creates at least 7 to 15 jobs downstream in the economy. Okay, that's a very good thing. It's a very powerful job creator. It's a reason why we have pockets of just destitute communities across this country that used to be powerhouses of manufacturing, and now those communities are unfortunately riddled with drug use, with substance abuse. The living standards and wages have declined drastically. I care about those places. That's why we care about manufacturing. And we shouldn't allow another country to use predatory illegal trade activity to undermine our industrial sector. That's the kind of economy that I want to create.
Ditto, 100%. It's confusing, I think, to the everyday American. Okay, we're it's almost mind-boggling. But let's get back because the solar industry is a great example on steroids, by the way. Okay, so back in 2000, China sees an opportunity. They dive into this. This is an industry that we created. Okay,
exactly. Yeah.
Take it from there.
Yeah. So the industry was, obviously young, but it was innovating and it was growing. And as soon as China set its sights on it, we had facilities closing. It's the same story in other industries that China did. They subsidized their industry, they overproduced, and they dumped product. And probably a lot of listeners will remember in 2009 when President Obama was in office, President Biden was the vice president. They passed a law called the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So that was when Obama said, we have all these shovel-ready jobs, and that's probably what a lot of folks will remember from there. But what people might not recognize or remember is that there was actually massive incentives for renewable energy industry production in the United States in the Recovery Act. And because we did not have a good trade policy that aligned with the Recovery Act, after the Recovery Act was signed into law, 16 solar facilities in the United States closed afterwards, not before, after. And why? It's because our trade policy allowed China to dump product into the market and undercut our manufacturers. And that's why in 2012, President Obama was the first president to put tariffs on Chinese solar. If we fast forward to today, the tariffs have been in place, but like I mentioned, China has circumvented. They've set up shop in Southeast Asia to get around our tariffs. And then we've had bad policies like the moratorium that actually just give them a green light to legally dump product here. And so now if we look at today, President Trump actually continued the Obama tariffs and he strengthened them in some cases. Biden has left them in place, obviously outside of the moratorium. So we've seen a resurgence of the U.S. solar manufacturing industry, and that's a great thing.
So I'd like to, because we talked a lot about the tariffs needed to be stronger on China, and I know, several U.S. solar manufacturers petitioned the U.S. International Trade Commission for tariffs on countries that were essentially enabling China to take advantage of these loopholes. I want to definitely spend some time on that. We got about 10 minutes left. Can you explain to our listeners, what the International Trade Commission is and does and the process for petitioning for tariffs?
Yeah, it's basically a body that domestic producers can petition or request that they look into potentially trade activity that's violating U.S. law, and with the caveat that there has to be an injury to the domestic industry. So, of course, in the case of China, it's rampant. So basically the process is the domestic industry, the producers could be one, it could be multiple. There was a trade case in 2022 followed by one solar manufacturer, Oxen Solar. Commerce ultimately found that what China was doing was illegal. In the new case that was filed in April, it's actually 7 major solar manufacturers across the nation. So they went and petitioned the ITC. They have evidence and data and say, look, what China's doing is illegal. It's in violation of U.S. law. It's injuring the solar industry and its workers. So the ITC voted last week preliminarily to say, okay, the evidence that you've given us does prove out that we should initiate this investigation. That investigation will occur, over the next weeks and months, and then there'll be preliminary findings and then final determination. And so, those findings will determine what duty rates will go onto the Chinese solar. And this is coming from Southeast Asia. So, I remember when I said Obama put tariffs on Chinese solar in 2012, China's very smart. They went and they set up mini Chinas in 4 Southeast Asian countries: Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia. All the major Chinese solar manufacturers have massive operations there. So they produce something in China, they finish it in those 4 Southeast Asian countries, and they ship it to the U.S. In the eyes of the U.S. government, under our trade laws, that's illegal. And of course, they're shipping it to underprice the American company. It's not that they say, Q-Cells or Mission Solar or Meyer Burger, they sell something for, $20, so we'll sell it for $22. No, they sell it for $10, and they keep going down until the U.S. company has to exit the market.
What are we doing? Why aren't we expanding the tariffs to these other countries?
Well, that's what this case will be about. It will actually put AD/CVD orders on those countries, and it'll actually be down to, I believe, the wafer and the cell. So that's a very important distinction. That's an input, obviously, into a final panel. So this case is very important. It's a critical case.
How do you think it plays out?
I think that there's almost 100% certainty that what the ITC and Commerce will find is that what the Chinese are doing is illegal. And so we'll have the end result of this case will be that our companies can compete on a level playing field, which is what we're asking for. And again, we go back to this discussion about free trade. There's nothing free trade, free market economics happening in the case of China. It doesn't exist. That's why these tools are so important. we can have a market in this country. I'm a free market person. I don't want a government managed economy or anything like that. But what I do want is for our government to step in when there's something that is anti-competitive market occurring to hurt our companies and workers. Because again, we went back to the point, if you put up an American worker on a level playing field with any other country, I'm going to choose the American worker. We're going to win.
100%. And the standards and the environmental standards, I mean,
the premier standards in the world.
Exactly.
And in the case of China, you can't even have a comparison because there's nothing that you could even look at that would allow you to have a conversation to say, well, our standards are somewhat comparable to them. It's not even in the same realm of the world.
Yeah, it's like we're self-mutilating. We have, we can stop this, okay, and yet we're arguing with ourselves. But this is a like I said, deja vu all over again in almost every energy arena. Nick, we have about a couple minutes left, and there's not, there's so much even more to talk about. Okay, how are our domestic solar manufacturers reacting to what's going on? It seems like some tides are being turned. It seems like there's some hope now. Okay. What is the attitude in the industry now domestically?
Well, when the moratorium was put in place, the White House didn't consult with a single American solar manufacturer on that decision. Not a single one. So they were pretty upset by that. It was essentially a green light for China to dump product into the U.S. to actually harm our American manufacturers. But then with the Inflation Reduction Act passing, that was a very good, positive development for them. And so now that the moratorium has ended, we have this case before the ITC that's moving forward. I think the sentiment is pretty good. I think the folks in the White House actually understand that we have to have our trade policy and industrial policy aligned. So the future is looking bright, but there's things that we need to do to make sure that our policies are actually supporting our goals. And the one major thing that to talk about in the last couple minutes, in the Inflation Reduction Act, there is no prohibition on China coming to the U.S., setting up an assembly plant, and taking American taxpayer dollars to do it. That should be fixed. The CCP already subsidizes its solar industry. We should not be subsidizing the Chinese solar industry if they come to the U.S. with American taxpayer dollars. That's asinine. So we're working to fix that and close that loophole. We have pretty good bipartisan support for doing so. Folks that listen to your show will probably know Senator Sherrod Brown, Senator Bob Casey. These are two senators that are concerned about this. Senator Marco Rubio is another one, Tom Cotton. So, it's not just Republicans, or it's not just Democrats. There's pretty good acknowledgement on both sides of the aisle that we should prohibit China from benefiting from the IRA. So that's a major step that we need to take that we haven't done yet.
What can real quick, what can the American people do who are listening to this show to double down on that message that you just said?
Very simple. Call up your congressman and your two senators and say, I don't want China to benefit from the IRA. Those are taxpayer dollars that should be going to companies that are not trying to undermine our country. And I don't, as a taxpayer, all of us pay taxes. I don't want my taxpayer dollars going to a Chinese company, period. And they should close that loophole in the IRA. And there's bills to do it.
Absolutely. And now is the time, obviously. Nick Iacovella, Coalition for a Prosperous America. I want to thank you so much for joining us and for doing the work that you do on behalf of our domestic companies and our domestic and our American workforce. Okay, because it's so important. We cannot continue to allow this to happen, and it's happening in so many areas. We appreciate you being on the show, Nick.
Hey, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Fantastic. We'll have more from the Labor and Energy Show in just a minute.
The best way to describe Anthony, David, and Jan are that they're my brothers. I met Anthony at LA Fitness because I noticed that he had a Teamster's bag and his dad was a Teamster leader.
I'm a third generation son of labor. My grandmother worked in a factory. My mother and father were both Teamster members. I don't think there's a trade that I don't have a family member in.
What's so big for me coming from a union background is what affects one member affects the entire membership.
A lot of people can relate to the issues that individuals deal with. We pride ourselves on empathy.
The big value that's always instilled in you if you grow up in a union household is the importance of brotherhood. People that lean on each other, that rely on each other.
When we were building this business, having that background and knowing what matters most to the union members is really what we use to drive and build out Retiree First.
Welcome to Pond Lehocky, the largest workers' compensation law firm in Pennsylvania. With over 250 years of combined courtroom experience, we've helped over 100,000 injured and disabled workers obtain benefits, as well as some of the biggest settlements in the state. Even better, Pond Lehocky doesn't charge a dime until you win. If you've been injured at work, give Pond Lehocky a call.
Is the best vacation one that you find or one you get lost in? One that takes you to new heights or reminds you to go with the flow? To get your feet wet and your wheels spinning? One that lets you find your own rhythm or get carried away? Find the best of yourself. Get lost in the woods. Plan your stay in the Wildwoods today.
And back here on the Labor and Energy Show with JDoc and Krausey, only about 90 seconds, JDoc, left here for us in the final segment. Good conversation with you and Nick.
Absolutely, Joe. Nick Iacovella, the conversation that we just had is another discussion. Thank God we have organizations that are standing up for our domestic manufacturers. It's just another example, Joe, though, of what, and you talk about our oil industry, you talk about our auto industry, and of course another part of our energy industry now, solar, renewables. We're just allowing China to run roughshod, okay, and putting ourselves out. You look at the American standards for our environmental standards, okay, for lowering emissions, for our workforce, okay. You look at slave labor, all these things that are going on over in China. That's why they can undercut us, and yet we're allowing them to do it. And so,
well, that's the biggest travesty of it all, JDoc. That sentence right there. We're allowing them to do it. Now, it was encouraging to hear Nick end the show, or end his segment rather, with conversation about bipartisan support to bring all of this tax funding by us for the Chinese. Crazy.
It is, and I'm happy for domestic manufacturers, okay, because there's a shot now, okay, and certainly the Inflation Reduction Act, has a ton of stuff in it that should impact our manufacturers, and we can do this, okay, we can do this together. But no more Twilight Zone-esque things. Joe, we talk about it all the time. I mean, common sense and energy security and all those things. We write our own. We can determine our own future here, okay, and still have a good positive trade policy, okay. But we can't do it at our own expense. We can't allow China and other countries that are circumventing these laws to benefit, okay, from our Inflation Reduction Act. We got to get our stuff together, and per Nick Iacovella, it looks like we are going in the right direction. Again, the American people should reach out to their policymakers and make sure this gets done.
That's going to do it for this edition of the Labor and Energy Show with JDoc and Krausey. Of course, we thank everybody for tuning in and being a part of the broadcast. Download the podcast version of this program and re-listen to some of that conversation. Until next time, on behalf of JDoc, I'm Joe Kraus. See you next time, everybody.
My name is Eleanor Northaft. My husband was in the union, local 282. And as I'm getting older, I would like somebody to fight for me. So I called up Retiree First.
Hi.
And I got Brooke.
So nice to meet you.
I'm Brooke. I'm an advocate at Retiree First. I've been working with Eleanor for 3 years. She was one of my first calls. I helped her with transportation to her doctors, getting her glasses reimbursed.
Oh, they are pretty fancy.
I'm basically just answering any questions she has.
And I always have a lot of questions.
Not too many.
I have a friend there. I love it because I can depend on her to help me out in any situation.
Oh, I'm excited.
She always comes through for me.